Yusuf ibn Ayyub, also known as Salah ad-Din or Saladin, meaning righteous of the faith. To Muslims, he was the Sultan who reclaimed their holy city of Jerusalem from Christian European Crusaders. To those same Crusaders, he became a symbol of generosity and chivalrous rulership. Beyond them, his career was also one of the more dramatic in the medieval Middle East, rising from obscurity to ruler of Egypt and Syria, and founding a dynasty that would last for 100 years. Welcome to Strategy Stuff, and this is the story of how Saladin became the greatest prince in an age of great princes. Saladin first appeared in history in the early 1160s. By that time, the Crusaders had already been in the Levant for over 60 years. Combined, the Crusader states of Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem stretched down the entire Mediterranean coastline, their minority rule anchored by formidable castles, defended by the well-financed military orders, and supplied by the various Italian navies. Above all, Crusader rule was sustained through the disunity of the Muslims who surrounded them. The split between the Shiite Arabs of Fatimid Egypt and the Sunni Turks of nominally Abbasid Syria, which was responsible for the success of the First Crusade, was still going strong at this time. On top of this, both regions suffered from internal infighting that prevented any focus on external affairs. Syria, in particular, had long been a land of competing warlords. In the 1130s, the Turkic emir Zanki finally united northern Syria and northern Iraq under one banner. Using their combined forces, he practically extinguished the Crusader state of Edessa. But upon his assassination in 1146, his realm was split between his sons, and the region fell back into disunity. But this time, any Crusader respite from Zanki's death would be short-lived. A new cultural and religious atmosphere was taking root within the Syrian cities, spurred on by decades of conflict and Christian rule over Jerusalem. Muslim clerics were now preaching holy war against the infidel, and were willing to transfer their support, and the support of their flock, to any ruler who dedicated himself to it. Zanki's second son, Nur ad-Din, recognized and acted on this opportunity, fashioning himself as a pious ruler and heir to his father's anti-Crusader legacy. He established a simple and austere court, funded only by taxes that were religiously allowed. He promoted Sunni Islam within the realm, subsidizing its imams and institutions while driving away those of other creeds. And finally, he promised to wage holy war on behalf of the Sunni Abbasids, not just against the Crusaders, but also against the Shiite Fatimids of Egypt and the Muslims who allied with them. These initiatives greatly accelerated Nur ad-Din's expansion across Syria. Rival Muslims couldn't face him without being smeared as a Crusader ally, which came with the grave risk of urban riots or even wholesale defection. Instead, they were forced to become vassals of Nur ad-Din, who used their forces to first beat back the Second Crusade and then conquer half of Antioch soon after. These achievements, in turn, boosted Nur ad-Din's religious credentials and granted him the policy freedom needed to stabilize his new conquests, with the clergy explaining away his many deals with the Crusaders as being incremental steps towards the final recovery of Jerusalem. By the early 1160s, Nur ad-Din was master of most of Syria, with his realm nearly enveloping the Crusader Levant. Despite this, the resources of Syria alone were not enough to overcome the Crusaders' advantages, and in any case, Nur ad-Din also had other regional rivals to worry about, the Turkish Sultanate of Rum, and a re-emerging Byzantine Empire. Under these circumstances, Nur ad-Din had to be satisfied with piecemeal strikes against the Crusaders, alternating them with periods of truce where he could focus on other fronts instead. This was a strategic stalemate, but then came a golden opportunity in the form of a political refugee from Egypt. Egypt had always been a land of plenty, and it had often used its wealth to conquer both the Levant and Syria. By the 1150s, however, Egypt could no longer exert power beyond its borders. While the ruling Fatimid Caliphate employed a large bureaucracy to manage Egypt's resources, by the 1130s, their control over the government had been usurped by their viziers. These viziers, in turn, were soon challenged by provincial governors in charge of the country's trade ports, leading to an endless cycle of civil war and usurpation. In 1163, the latest cycle of this political instability played out, as the vizier Shawer was overthrown by his lieutenant Dilram. Unlike his predecessors, Shawer survived the coup and fled Egypt, eventually ending up in Nur ad-Din's court at Damascus. There, for the first time since the start of Egypt's instability, Shawer asked for foreign help in recovering the vizierate, promising to become a vassal of Nur ad-Din and to pay him a third of Egypt's revenues as tribute. The impact of Egyptian tribute would, of course, greatly enhance Nur ad-Din's capabilities, but the risks of an Egyptian expedition were also high. Any force sent there would not only be facing the large Egyptian army in unfamiliar territory, they would also have to slip past several fortresses owned by Jerusalem on the way, making reinforcement and retreat difficult. And with regional foes posed to pounce upon any failure, Nur ad-Din was hardly going to gamble much on Shawer's proposal. What he could do was dispatch a small elite force, which at best might provide a decisive edge for Shawer, and at worst return with some intelligence at relatively little cost. To lead this distant expedition, Nur ad-Din needed a general he trusted, and for that there was nobody else but Shirkuh, a Kurdish general who had served him since the beginning of his reign. But Shirkuh was a military man, and winning control of Egypt would require diplomacy as well as arms. Shirkuh's brother Ayub was the logical choice, having negotiated Nur ad-Din's takeover of Damascus, but he was old. So the role fell to Ayub's son Yusuf, later known as Saladin, who had experience governing Damascus's population. Shirkuh and Saladin were allowed to recruit a small band of Turkic and Kurdish cavalrymen, and in spring 1164 they set out towards Egypt with Shawer, bypassing Jerusalem's fortresses and oasis hopping across the Sinai. Upon hearing the news, Dilram sent out Egypt's infantry-heavy army to intercept, but they proved no match for the Syrian cavalry, and were defeated on the edge of the Nile Delta at the fortress of Bilbays. There, Shirkuh left Saladin with a garrison, while he proceeded with Shawer to the capital, Cairo, where Dilram launched a last-ditch attack and was killed. So with limited resistance, Syrian cavalry had successfully reinstalled Shawer back onto the vizierate. Shawer's gratitude lasted less than a month. He had not returned to power just to be ruled by Syrians, so now he made a new proposal, one where Shirkuh would be paid for his work and then leave. Unsurprisingly, Shirkuh rejected this, so Shawer turned to a plan that the late Dilram had been working on. Egyptian envoys were sent to King Amalric of Jerusalem, promising to pay him tribute if he would lead an army to Egypt and eject the Syrians. The perils of letting Nur ad-Din seize the resources of Egypt were obvious enough to the Crusaders, and so in July, Amalric set out on the coastal road from Jerusalem to Egypt. Recognizing that his small Syrian force was about to be overwhelmed, Shirkuh fell back to rejoin Saladin at Bilbays, followed by Amalric and Shawer, who besieged the fortress. After 3 months, all sides saw that there was no profit in continuing the fight, so Shirkuh accepted Shawer's new payment and everybody went home. Saladin's first campaign had ended rather ingloriously, though not before first achieving outsized success. Most importantly, the campaign had revealed the full weakness of the Fatimid state. It couldn't resist the Syrian cavalry, and probably not the Crusaders either. By voluntarily inviting in foreign intervention, Shawer had set in motion a new phase of instability that he would find difficult to stop. Shirkuh returned to Syria not only with a greater appreciation of Egypt's weakness, but also of Egypt's wealth, which, if he could control it, would make him one of the richest people in the world. On the other hand, Nur ad-Din had obtained a greater appreciation of the difficulties of controlling wealthy Egypt from embattled Syria. It wouldn't be easy to get him to authorize another expedition again. Shirkuh did this by invoking the religious basis for Nur ad-Din's rule. As mentioned, a holy warrior had to fight heretics as well as infidels, so Shirkuh wrote to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, pointing out that this was a golden opportunity to end the Fatimid Caliphate and bring Egypt back to Sunni Islam. The Abbasid Caliph reminded Nur ad-Din of his religious obligations, and accordingly, Shirkuh and Saladin were authorized to outfit another expedition. Shirkuh's preparations were detected early. By the time he left for Egypt in January 1167, Jerusalem had already dispatched another royal army to rescue Shawar. Not wishing to fight this army head-on, and perhaps recognizing the long-standing tensions between Cairo and the provinces, Shirkuh decided to try and instigate a rebellion against Shawar's government. For months, Syrians and Crusaders faced off across the Nile as Shirkuh tried to bring the local provincials and Bedouin to his side. Eventually, King Amalric bridged the river, and the Syrians were forced to leave, though not before bloodying the Crusaders in a cavalry clash. Shirkuh now focused on Egypt's main Mediterranean seaport, Alexandria, a longtime rival of Cairo as well as a bastion for the Sunni faith. The city opened its gates to him in May, and Saladin was again put in charge with orders to resist the inevitable siege. For the next 3 months, Shirkuh tried fruitlessly to raise the banner of revolt in southern and northern Egypt, while Saladin tried to govern Alexandria as it suffered under a joint blockade by the forces of Shawar, Jerusalem, and the Italian Republic of Pisa. The experience left a bad taste in Saladin's mouth, and at times the Syrians seemed to be more like the prisoners of the unruly Alexandrians. So when Shawar and Shirkuh finally struck another deal in August to have everybody evacuate Egypt, Saladin was only too happy to oblige. Saladin fully expected and wanted this failed second expedition to be the end of his time with Egypt. Shawar's government had the support of Jerusalem, and their combined force would surely outmatch whatever Shirkuh was allowed to bring on his expedition. Nur ad-Din's commitment to holy war made him the most dangerous threat to both Crusader and Fatimid alike, and so long as that situation held, the Syrians could have no place in Egypt. Luckily for Saladin's future career, the international situation was rapidly changing, driven by events far beyond Egypt and possibly already in motion even before Shirkuh's first expedition. The main driver for this change was the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos. By 1160, he had decided to oppose the other empire in Europe, the Holy Roman Empire of Friedrich Barbarossa. To this end, he aligned himself with many Christian Mediterranean states, including the Pope, Sicily, and the Crusader states. And while the focus of this diplomacy was to counter Friedrich's expansion in Italy, it also offered opportunities to mutually support Christian expansion into the Muslim Middle East. Soon after ejecting Shirkuh's second expedition from Egypt, King Amalric decided to put his Byzantine alliance to the test. Like Nur ad-Din, the Crusaders clearly would gain much from the conquest of Egypt, but they had always been constrained by their scarce resources and the need to defend against Syria. Now, the king sent an embassy to Emperor Manuel, asking for Byzantine forces to help conquer Egypt. But under Jerusalem's feudal system, the king was not the only one with a say in strategy. He needed the cooperation of his lords and military orders as well, if only to obtain their forces for the proposed attack. And they were not happy about the appeal to Emperor Manuel, whose influence might well displace their own at court. Of the two military orders, only the Knights Hospitaller joined the expedition, while the High Court of the Lords forced the king to adopt an alternative strategy: attack Egypt immediately without waiting for the emperor's response. So on October 1168, King Amalric's army assembled and rapidly marched towards the Nile Delta, seizing the fortress of Bilbaeus as Shirkuh had done 4 years ago. The Crusaders might have hoped to take Cairo by storm, but when they got there, they found that Shawar had already devastated the outskirts to deny war materiel to the invaders. The vizier was still willing to pay the Crusaders to leave, however. Lacking any better options, Amalric agreed to give Shawar time to collect the tribute. Instead, Shawar did what he did best. he sent an urgent appeal to Damascus, asking Nur ad-Din to defend Egypt from the Crusaders. He again offered a third of Egypt's revenues as tribute, and promised this time to let Shirkuh permanently stay in the country. Even accounting for Shower's unreliable character, it was clearly in Nur ad-Din's interest to stop the Crusader takeover, so he quickly topped up Shirkuh's expedition with some cavalry of his own, and sent them all to Shower's aid. Shirkuh and Saladin arrived just in time to see the army of Jerusalem withdrawing before them, King Amalric having abandoned even the demand for Egypt to pay tribute. On January 1169, Shirkuh entered Cairo, and soon found an excuse to kill the duplicitous Shower. Shirkuh now became the new vizier, but he died shortly thereafter. As his closest relative in Egypt, and with a fair bit of experience under his belt, Saladin was chosen by the Syrian cavalry to be their new leader. Still, the choice was not unanimous, and many dissenters decided to return home to Nur ad-Din instead. The Fatimid Caliph now approved Saladin as the new vizier, making him the fifth person to hold the position within the past 6 years. One might have considered this promotion more of a curse than a blessing. Not only was Saladin now the focus of the many plots festering within the Egyptian bureaucracy, he also had to tread a fine line between the demands of his Syrian master, the Sunni holy warrior Nur ad-Din, and the demands of the Shiite Fatimid Caliph, under whose authority he was vizier. Beyond that, King Amalric might have withdrawn to Jerusalem empty-handed, but he did so in the knowledge that he would likely return to Egypt soon, and this time with a Byzantine fleet in support. The next few years would be treacherous waters indeed, and to survive them, Saladin would need not just all of his skill, but perhaps all of his luck as well. When we last left Saladin in the spring of 1169, he had just been appointed vizier of Fatimid Egypt, one of the richest states of the medieval world, and quite the promotion for a 30-something-year-old. Inevitably, such power earned him internal and external enemies whose attacks he needed to fend off. Beyond them, Saladin's rulership would also be further tested as he sought to satisfy both his own dynastic ambitions and the demands of Sunni Islam's holy war. Saladin's ascent to the vizierate had not been legitimate. It was based on his leadership of the small but dominant Syrian occupying force which, acting under the orders of his late uncle and his Syrian liege lord Nur ad-Din, had first repelled an invasion from the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem and then killed the preceding Egyptian vizier. Furthermore, Saladin had little experience with something as sophisticated as Fatimid central government, whose officials, in turn, despised him as a culturally inferior Kurd. But for now, the most pressing threat Saladin faced was a second attack from Jerusalem, this time in league with the Byzantine Empire of Emperor Manuel Komnenos. Throughout the summer, the prospect of their invasion loomed over Egypt, threatening to destroy Saladin while he was still trying to find his feet. Luckily for him, the nobles of Jerusalem needed to recuperate from their first invasion of Egypt, and were also reluctant to see Byzantium make gains in their neighborhood. By the time the joint expedition finally set out in October, the Byzantine fleet had exhausted much of its supply. The Allies could only manage a half-hearted siege of the Nile fortress of Damietta before giving up by year-end. Saladin did not personally see to Damietta's defense, choosing instead to stay in the capital of Cairo. He had good reason to do so. In the summer, he had uncovered a plot to overthrow him, involving both the Caliphal palace and large sections of the Fatimid army. They planned to wait until Saladin marched out to fight the Crusaders before launching a coup within the city. Upon the plot's discovery, Saladin immediately took action against the conspirators, sparking a major battle within the walls of Cairo itself. The result was a massacre of Fatimid supporters within the capital, with the survivors fleeing to Upper Egypt. There, they would regroup and launch new pro-Fatimid rebellions over the next couple of years, each attempt bloodily suppressed by Saladin's forces. These struggles severely destabilized this once prosperous region and sent a large emigration wave into neighboring Nubia, inadvertently contributing to the Islamization of what is now modern Sudan. With the defeat of the Crusaders and the Fatimid conspirators, Saladin had finally secured his power over Egypt. Now, he could finally start thinking about what to do with it. The Egypt that Saladin inherited was far poorer than at the height of the Fatimids, due to decades of instability and Saladin's suppression. Nevertheless, Saladin's domestic policies focused not so much on rehabilitating the economy, but on redistributing wealth to his supporters and refashioning the country into a base for his dynasty. As mentioned, despite his official titles, Saladin's power ultimately came from his leadership of the Syrian force in Egypt, which, in turn, rested on Saladin's ability to reward his sub-commanders with land and wealth. There was also a good military reason to do this. The past few years had fully demonstrated that Fatimid Egypt's infantry-heavy army was no match for the Crusader and especially Syrian cavalry. As such, Saladin reassigned large portions of Egypt's revenue to his allies and family members, expecting them to use some of the money to maintain personal cavalry forces that would then join Saladin on campaign. By 1171, this policy yielded a cavalry force of about 14,000, better suited to fighting Crusaders, but also far smaller and more independent-minded than the Fatimid army had been. The high expenses involved with raising cavalry meant cutbacks elsewhere, especially on the navy and coastal defense. Without the resources to fully secure his coastline, Saladin had little choice but to preemptively destroy vulnerable coastal settlements, foreshadowing Mamluk policy after the conquest of the Crusader Levant a century later. Saladin's financial problems were not eased by the other aspect of his domestic policy. Anxious to establish a claim to Egypt that didn't come from either Nur ad-Din's orders or the Fatimid caliph's titles, Saladin followed the example of his Syrian master and rebranded himself as a holy warrior who would use Egypt's resources to fight the enemies of Sunni Islam. Under his government, un-Islamic goods were banned and unsanctioned taxes were abolished outright. Sunni religious institutions received generous support from the state, while non-believers were resubjected to the discrimination of religious law. Cleverly, Saladin took advantage of the sophisticated Egyptian bureaucracy to produce exceptional propaganda, trumpeting his own austerity and piety while slandering his rivals as personally or politically irreligious. These works, written by subordinates such as Qadi al-Fadl or Imad ad-Din, form the base of Saladin's reputation even today. Nevertheless, all the propaganda in the world couldn't cover the fact that this Sunni holy warrior was still the chief minister for a heretic Shiite caliph. In 1171, this contradiction was finally put to the test when the Sunni Abbasid caliph, along with Nur ad-Din, demanded that Saladin finally end the Fatimids. Despite the reputation he was trying to build, Saladin moved cautiously. First, he slowly replaced outgoing Shiite religious leaders with Sunni ones. Then, he quietly removed the Fatimid name from Friday prayers. Finally, and conveniently, the Fatimid caliph died soon after, and Saladin declined to name a successor. And so, in this rather stealthy manner, Egypt formally returned to Sunni Islam. Ending Fatimid rule was undoubtedly an achievement for Saladin the holy warrior, but for Saladin the aspiring dynasty builder, this act opened up a major can of worms. Previously, whenever Saladin wanted to act differently to the wishes of his Syrian liege lord Nur ad-Din, he could always claim to have a competing responsibility to the Fatimids as their vizier. But now the Fatimids were gone, and the power that Saladin had so painstakingly amassed was now at risk of being usurped by Nur ad-Din. Nur ad-Din had initially authorized the takeover of Egypt with one goal in mind: to break the strategic stalemate that had existed primarily between Syria, Egypt, and the Crusaders, where no single side had the resources to both conquer one state and defend against the other's intervention. Now that Egypt was in Syrian hands, Nur ad-Din wanted both states to coordinate their attacks and jointly overwhelm the Crusaders. Saladin's role in this was to merely follow Nur ad-Din's direction, a point that the Syrian leader emphasized when he refused to acknowledge Saladin as Fatimid vizier, instead addressing him only as the Syrian commander in Egypt. Nur ad-Din wanted Saladin to do two things: send tribute to Syria and send armies to support Syrian attacks. But Saladin, much to his liege lord's anger, failed to do either satisfactorily. When it came to tribute, Saladin repeatedly claimed, not unjustifiably, that his current revenues could barely support even Egypt's own defense. These excuses exasperated Nur ad-Din to such a point that he actually sent a team to audit Egypt's finances, a move that Saladin considered a personal insult. Similarly, when it came to military support, Saladin again proved reluctant to coordinate with Syrian forces, even though the Crusader-Byzantine alliance against Egypt was still going strong. Twice, in 1171 and 1173, Saladin had besieged major Crusader castles blocking the route between Egypt and Syria, only to pack up and leave as soon as Nur ad-Din's army approached. To an enraged Nur ad-Din, these moves seemed to indicate that Saladin was plotting to separate Egypt from Syrian rule. In response, Nur ad-Din got the Abbasid Caliph to formally acknowledge Syrian rule over Egypt, and by 1174 was preparing to enforce this through yet another invasion. This growing political pressure from Nur ad-Din and the desire to escape it might explain why Saladin sought expansion beyond the Crusader Levant. In 1172, an Egyptian force set out to take control of the Libyan oases, which over the next 2 decades developed into a small-scale war with the Almohads over modern-day Tunisia. 2 years later, Saladin's brother set out to conquer Yemen, claiming that its rulers had become heretics. Whatever the reasons, these minor conquests provided Saladin's army with a small trickle of plunder, and his family members with a few impoverished lands that they quickly grew unsatisfied with. All in all, despite Nur ad-Din's expectations, the Syrian conquest of Egypt did not actually break the strategic stalemate in the region, because Saladin was more interested in defending his independence than executing the will of his liege lord. Despite this, the Crusaders were now more isolated than ever before, not just because Saladin's victory had removed Egypt as a potential ally, but also because of the collapse of the Byzantine Crusader alliance in the mid-1170s, which led Emperor Manuel to even help Saladin fight off Sicilian naval raids. In any case, after Manuel's death in 1180, Byzantium rapidly weakened and ceased to be a relevant factor in the region. Saladin's diplomacy with the Byzantines showcased the highly personal and chance nature of medieval strategy, where the presence or absence of a single leader could generate sea changes in regional politics that would have been inconceivable only a short while before. Starting in 1174, Saladin would benefit from an incredible 13-year run of lucky deaths, which would cumulatively break the regional strategic stalemate, bring Syria under Saladin's rule, and herald the Crusaders' downfall. In May 1174, right on the cusp of invading Egypt, the Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din died, leaving an underage son, as-Salih. Almost overnight, Syria shattered into a collection of mutually antagonistic regions, chief amongst them Aleppo, Damascus, and Mosul. Saladin took the opportunity to declare himself as the rightful regent for as-Salih, claiming authority over all 3 cities. Saladin's ambitions received a further boost in August, when King Amalric of Jerusalem died and was succeeded by Baldwin IV, who was periodically incapacitated by leprosy. As Crusader nobles bitterly fought over their own regency and succession, Saladin rode into Damascus with 700 cavalry and swept through most of Syria, quickly reaching and besieging as-Salih's base of Aleppo. If Saladin believed that this bold stroke would conquer Syria and end the aforementioned strategic stalemate, he, like Nur ad-Din, was to be badly mistaken. Recognizing the greater danger, Mosul and the notorious Shiite sect of the Assassins came to Aleppo's aid. and while Saladin easily defeated their forces in battle, his cavalry commanders were reluctant to spend much money and time sieging down their castles. Saladin therefore felt little choice but to settle with As-Salih in 1176, finally becoming a fully independent sultan in his own right, but at the price of having a latent threat in his northeastern rear. Saladin now turned against Jerusalem, but a similar story of stalemate awaited him there. An initial strike led to an embarrassing defeat at Montgisard in October 1177, though the Muslims would make up the loss 2 years later when they seized the half-built castle of Chastelet. But once again, Saladin's cavalry commanders recoiled at the prospect of sieging down Jerusalem's castles, and they pressured Saladin to turn his attention back northeast to Mosul. And so, by 1180, despite the notorious raids of Reynald de Chatillon that were occurring at the same time, Saladin was back plundering the lands of northern Syria, claiming that the threats from Mosul and the Turkish Sultanate of Rum were preventing him from focusing on Jerusalem. Here, Saladin caught another lucky break, as As-Salih of Aleppo died in December 1181, unleashing yet another succession dispute. Mosul initially took control of the city, but Saladin launched a year-long campaign in response and ultimately obtained it in June 1183. Syria and Egypt were now united under one ruler, but this still did not end the strategic stalemate. For one, Saladin's commanders remained reluctant to wage a long siege campaign against Jerusalem, preventing Saladin from making much headway against the kingdom. More importantly, Saladin continued to prioritize Mosul first, seeing it both as a persistent distraction from Jerusalem and as an easier source of plunder. But the more he fought Mosul, the more he became enmeshed in a cycle of perpetual eastern wars. Just as happened during the first siege of Aleppo, Saladin's aggression prompted other regional lords to support Mosul, forcing Saladin to commit more resources to this front instead of Jerusalem. Even worse, each victory over Mosul only served to heighten regional fears about Saladin's power, prompting the formation of a fresh coalition to support Mosul once again. By 1185, Saladin's army was campaigning in distant Armenia, fighting forces backed by Persian Hamadan, regions that had few connections to either Jerusalem or Mosul. But then, in December 1185, Saladin suddenly fell ill, and for the next 3 months was on the brink of death. During this time, he doubtlessly reflected on his failure to pursue holy war. In the decade since Nur ad-Din's death, he had spent about a year campaigning against the Crusaders, as compared to 3 fighting other Muslims. Ashamed, Saladin swore that, if and when he recovered, he would refocus his efforts back on Jerusalem from then on. He was helped in this commitment by yet another series of lucky breaks. In 1186, Hamadan fell into civil war. Seeing this, Mosul hastened to become Saladin's vassal on lenient terms, abruptly cutting the cycle of coalition warfare that was keeping him in the east. But even this paled in significance to what was happening in Jerusalem at the same time, where both Baldwin IV and his successor, the immature Baldwin V, had died within 18 months of each other. The resulting succession dispute amongst the Crusader lords would give the Muslims the opening that they had been waiting for. In the last video, we detailed how Saladin secured Egypt and conquered Syria before committing to holy war against the Crusader states. In 1187, this culminated in his decisive victory at Hattin, the surrender of Jerusalem, and the near conquest of the Crusader Levant. While Hattin and its aftermath demonstrated Saladin's military and strategic competence, it was, above all, the end result of a decade of Crusader failure, both strategically and politically. We must therefore shift perspective temporarily towards them and see why they failed so utterly to stop Saladin. Ever since the First Crusade, the key strategic problem the Crusader states faced was how to defend their minority rule over their limited territory when their Muslim foes often surrounded and out-resourced them. One answer came at the military level, where the Crusaders developed a template based around the castle and the field army. In the event of an invasion, castles would stall and weaken the enemy army, buying time for the Crusaders to mobilize their field army. This field army would then march out and, with their castles in support, face down the enemy, who would now have to choose between either accepting battle under bad odds or else retreat. Usually, they chose the latter. A key point to note here is that both castle and field army needed the other's support to be useful. A castle without a relieving army would be easily bypassed. A field army without castles would be exposed to the full strength of the Muslim army. This meant that field armies, in particular, needed to choose their battles carefully. They especially should not venture brazenly beyond castle range and offer battle in the open. A field army in such circumstances risked total annihilation, which in turn would cause large numbers of castles and their associated territories to fall into Muslim hands. This Crusader military template worked well, even against Saladin. Many of his attacks against the Kingdom of Jerusalem ended up with his army stuck before a castle, and eventually retreating due to the incoming field army or simple lack of supplies. Saladin never found a counter to the template. He tried outwitting it once in 1177 when he bypassed the castles of southern Jerusalem in a bid to eliminate the mobilizing Crusader field army. He ended up in an even bigger failure, as the castle garrisons sallied out, crushed his overstretched army, and forced him into a harrowing retreat. With the military template, the Crusaders could avoid being overrun by large Muslim forces, at least in the short term. The template was of less help in the medium term, however, especially against the strategy of attrition. If the Muslims constantly invaded, the Crusaders would have to constantly raise field armies. And since the Muslims had more resources, the Crusaders would go bankrupt first. And at that point, even the military template wouldn't save the Levant. To deal with this, the Crusaders therefore needed another answer, this time at the strategic level. They needed to find a protector, meaning an ally that could either deter the Muslims or replenish Crusader resources. But there was an inherent tension within the concept. Any state powerful enough to protect the Crusaders would also be powerful enough to dominate them and interfere with the cherished autonomy of the local nobility. As a result, unlike at the military level, the Crusaders ultimately failed to agree on a suitable strategic protector. The ideal ones were always the powerful yet distant kingdoms of Western Europe, but starting in the 1150s, France and Angevin England began a decades-long struggle against each other, leaving few resources for the Levant. By the 1160s, Byzantium had become the new protectors, but their constant interference in local affairs made them hated by the nobility. Then, in 1174, just as Saladin began conquering Syria, the underage Baldwin IV became king of Jerusalem, requiring a noble regent to manage affairs. The role soon fell to the great lord Raymond of Tripoli, who, like his peers, disliked and soon rejected Byzantium. Raymond believed he had a perfect replacement, the Holy Roman Empire of Friedrich Barbarossa, who at this time had just reconquered northern Italy and through it gained a Mediterranean link to the Levant. It proved to be a poor decision. The HRE was opposed by Jerusalem's traditional allies, Byzantium, Sicily, and even the Pope, and Raymond's defection caused them to suspend support just when it was needed against Saladin. Even worse, Barbarossa was soon ejected from Italy and lost all ability to protect Jerusalem. So as soon as Baldwin IV came of age, he reversed Raymond's policy and returned to Byzantium, even while he hoped for Western Europe to assume the role. Jerusalem's strategic situation would have been strong with a reliable protector in support, as shown in the Flanders Crusade of 1177. By this time, Saladin had conquered southern Syria and was in stalemate with Aleppo and Mosul. Sensing opportunity, Jerusalem secured Byzantine help for another invasion of Egypt, and their forces were further bolstered by the arrival of Western Europeans led by the Count of Flanders. Greatly threatened, Saladin left Syria to defend Egypt. Had Jerusalem and its protectors kept up this pressure, Saladin would probably have remained in Egypt, extending the Muslim disunity so key to the Crusaders' survival. Instead, the Flanders Crusade showed why Jerusalem never found reliable protectors. Despite being under Byzantium's protection, once Flanders arrived, Baldwin asked him to take over the government. Flanders instead demanded rule over Egypt, which Baldwin rejected as an unacceptable intrusion into his authority. Raymond then redirected Flanders to attack Aleppo, successfully cancelling the Egyptian invasion. The whole episode achieved nothing except further dampening any desire to help the Crusaders. Byzantium saw them as completely treacherous, while Western Europe saw them as completely ungrateful. By the 1180s, the Crusaders were essentially left alone. The French and Angevin struggle intensified, while Byzantium turned xenophobic and then fell into civil war. Without a protector in support, Jerusalem's resources would be stretched thin against Saladin. Between 1180 and 87, it mobilized its full military population 4 times, repeatedly requisitioned property and sold privileges, and even experimented with a form of income tax. In desperation, it also began to beg for peace. First, by dropping the demand for Muslims to pay tribute, then later, paying its own tribute to Saladin. The Crusaders' strategic failure contributed to their political failure, as the worsening environment encouraged intrigue and unilateral action. Furthermore, King Baldwin's infamous leprosy meant that he was both frequently incapacitated and likely to die while his nephew, as heir, was still a baby. That meant that anybody acting as Baldwin's regent would rule Jerusalem for the next decade or more. Recognizing this, Baldwin's father had given the regency to a trusted ally, but this man was soon assassinated, and in his place came Raymond of Tripoli, the greatest lord in Jerusalem. Rumor soon swirled that Raymond had designs on the throne, but his policy failures soon became a stumbling block. Raymond had justifiably failed to stop Saladin from conquering the political vacuum of Syria, and had also unjustifiably failed in the pivot to the HRE. This was too much failure for him to lead Jerusalem. So in 1176, Baldwin ended Raymond's regency and immediately reversed his policies. Ironically, he could do this thanks to a few ex-prisoners of war, whose release from Aleppo was one of Raymond's major achievements. Nevertheless, these fallen nobles realized that their only shot at power lay in supporting the king, and they were right, with Baldwin rewarding one of their leaders, the infamous Reynald de Chatillon, with the fiefdom of Ulch-Jourdain, instantly making him as powerful as Raymond. Hungry for land and worried about Muslim consolidation, Baldwin's new men advocated renewed aggression against Saladin. One result was the aforementioned Flanders Crusade. Reynald also invaded the Sinai to try and bisect Saladin's empire, while Baldwin built a castle to permanently threaten Damascus. But without a protector, these efforts were eventually overwhelmed by Saladin. Baldwin's failures emboldened his political opponents. In 1180, Raymond led an army to Jerusalem's borders, intending to regain power. He would do this by forcing a marriage upon Baldwin's widowed sister Sibylla, whose son was heir to the throne. If Sibylla married Raymond's ally, Baldwin would have no choice but to designate this husband and Raymond's faction as the future regent. In a panic, Baldwin swiftly married Sibylla off to one of his new men, Guy de Lusignan. Given the circumstances, it wasn't a bad choice. Guy had military experience, and crucially, as an ex-vassal of the Angevins, he stood a good chance of getting the King of England's protection. Just to be safe, Baldwin also married off his other sister, Isabella, to Reynald's stepson. Thus foiled, Raymond returned to Tripoli, where he began a tense standoff against the king. Baldwin was focused elsewhere, as the unexpected death of Aleppo's ruler in 1181 now threatened to bring northern Syria under Saladin's rule. A desire to prevent this likely motivated Reynald's infamous Arabian raids, where his mercenaries invaded the Red Sea and even threatened Islam's holy cities of Mecca and Medina. It worked to an extent, as Saladin urgently redeployed away from Aleppo, allowing Mosul to take over the city. But by 1183, Mosul had failed, Aleppo was in Saladin's hands, and the Muslims could now pay the Crusaders back with interest. Saladin now invaded northern Jerusalem, prompting Raymond to hastily reconcile with an incapacitated Baldwin. Guy, as stepfather to the heir, was then designated regent and took command of the field army. He followed the Crusader military template to a T. For a month, he cautiously faced down Saladin's army, refusing to venture beyond the support range of his castles, even as Saladin staged provocative raids on holy sites. Eventually, the Muslims ran out of supplies and again retreated. As far as invasions went, this had not been a terrible outcome for Jerusalem, but Raymond's faction nevertheless used it to severely criticize Guy's leadership. They blamed him for not immediately attacking and thus letting Saladin raid, which was a pure bad faith argument that went against everything in the Crusader military template. A better argument might have noted that Jerusalem didn't have the resources to continuously mobilize against Saladin, and that sooner or later, Guy would have to risk battle, or else let Saladin bleed the kingdom into inevitable defeat. In any case, the final straw came when Guy rejected Baldwin's demand to return a few valuable fiefdoms. In a rage, Baldwin purged Guy from the regency, made Raymond the new regent, and demanded Sibylla divorce her husband. In response, Guy and Sibylla fled to southern Jerusalem, where they began yet another tense standoff. After 6 months of this, Baldwin's health failed, and he died. Baldwin's death left the Crusaders more strategically isolated and politically divided than they had ever been. His dutifulness in the face of leprosy was impressive, and by this time there were no easy fixes for Jerusalem's strategic failures. But Baldwin's political U-turns violated one of the key responsibilities of a ruler, which was to hand over a stable order to his successor. This failure would set the stage for the imminent disaster at Hattin. In the previous video, we detailed how the strategic and political failures of the Crusaders, particularly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, prevented them from effectively confronting Saladin. All these accumulated problems would come home to roost during the Hattin campaign of 1187, where Saladin would finally achieve his lifelong ambition. Baldwin V became the new king of Jerusalem in early 1185. He inherited a realm in big trouble, its borders permanently threatened by Saladin, its economy ruined by repeated mobilization, its allies too busy with their own affairs. The Crusader leadership was deeply split between the established and new nobility, and even his own mother and stepfather were in rebellion. Worse still, Baldwin V was only a child of 7, meaning that he needed a regent to govern for him. Under normal circumstances, Baldwin's stepfather, Guy de Lusignan, would be regent. His recent purge and revolt, however, left the regency in the hands of his political enemy, the great established Lord Raymond of Tripoli. But Raymond himself had also long been suspected of disloyalty, so he had to share much of his power with Guy's allies anyway. Little wonder, then, that Raymond hastened to make peace with Saladin, who was at this time stalled before Mosul. This policy is often seen as proof of Raymond's Islamophilia, but in reality, Raymond was too politically vulnerable to march out on campaign. He therefore could not allow Saladin any pretext to invade, even if it meant doing nothing as Saladin experienced his near-death illness. Presumably, Raymond expected Mosul and its allies to continue stalling Saladin, a hope which unexpectedly failed due to events in Persia, far beyond Jerusalem's control. By early 1186, Saladin was firmly committed to conquering Jerusalem. A few months later, Baldwin V died, and the kingdom's political turmoil reached a catastrophic peak. Medieval child mortality meant that this situation was not entirely unforeseen, but the succession plan had called for an extended consultation with the Pope and the Western European kings, which was utterly unrealistic given the imminent war. The choice could only be between Baldwin's surviving blood relatives, both female, either his mother Sibylla and her husband Guy, or his half-aunt Isabella and her husband, the stepson of the great new lord, Reynald de Chatillon. Given what followed, the history of what happened next is shrouded in highly partisan myth, but it is likely that the established nobility, led by Raymond, were prepared to accept Sibylla as queen, so long as she divorced Guy. Sibylla agreed, was proclaimed queen, but then went back on her word and made Guy king. This was not an act of irrational love as is often presented, but instead a recognition that Guy's military experience and connections with Angevin England still made him the best available option in these desperate times. Outraged, Raymond summoned the local nobles and tried to make Isabella queen instead. But Isabella and her husband sensibly refused to plunge Jerusalem into civil war, and Raymond's coup quickly collapsed. Raymond, nevertheless, remained defiant, retreating to his fiefdom in northern Jerusalem and launching a rebellion against Guy. To protect himself, Raymond even requested Saladin's protection, offering Muslim troops free reign across his territory. And it wasn't only Raymond going his own way. While all this was going on, the other great lord in Jerusalem, Reynald de Chatillon, decided to unilaterally attack Saladin's caravans, ignoring King Guy's orders to stop. This action was not as senseless as is often portrayed. Reynald recognized that war was imminent, and Saladin was probably using the caravans to move troops and supplies into position. Furthermore, by demonstrating his independence vis-à-vis the king, Reynald hoped to gradually turn his fiefdom of Ultra-Jourdain into a semi-autonomous state, allowing him to enjoy the same status as Raymond and his county of Tripoli. Whatever the reason, Reynald's actions gave the Muslims the desired pretext, and in 1187, Saladin ended the peace and declared holy war against Jerusalem. Despite his promise to capture Jerusalem, Saladin couldn't have had high expectations for the campaign of 1187. That's because he still had no counter to the Crusader military template, which we described in the previous video. In short, whenever Saladin invaded Jerusalem, his army would always be held up before a Crusader castle. This would give time for the Crusaders to mobilize their own field army and then march out, not to suicidally attack the large Muslim force, but to hold them up further. If Saladin wanted to push on, he would have to attack the Crusader army, even as Crusader castles menaced his rear. Saladin almost always chose to withdraw instead. The campaign's start gave no cause for optimism. Similar to previous invasions, Saladin first targeted Kerak, the castle of the truce-breaker Reynald. Kerak held out, the Crusaders mobilized, and a frustrated Saladin retreated. Saladin now switched his area of operations to Raymond's fiefdom in northern Jerusalem, where he hoped to use his military access to achieve a breakthrough. In May, the Muslim advance guard managed to surprise and destroy a large group of Crusaders there, eliminating about 10% of Jerusalem's knights. This was certainly a success, but its effect was neutralized somewhat when Raymond, under universal condemnation for his role in the disaster, renounced Saladin's protection and reconciled with King Guy. By this time, Jerusalem was in the throes of yet another extraordinary mobilization. This time, Guy appropriated treasure that was meant to fund a future Angevin crusade. The money was used to mobilize every castle garrison, producing an army of about 1,000 knights and 20,000 infantry. Saladin arrived in July with an army of 15,000 cavalry and 25,000 infantry. Similar to their previous confrontation in 1183, the armies engaged in a standoff with each other, Guy sticking to his military template and refusing to attack Saladin's army. With the benefit of hindsight, most historians have agreed with Guy's instincts here. But we should note that, just as before, Jerusalem didn't have the resources to continuously mobilize against Saladin. At some point, Guy needed to risk battle, or else see Jerusalem bleed out from 1,000 attacks. On the other side, Saladin knew that, if this campaign was to end in anything but another retreat, he needed to get the Crusaders to ditch their template and attack him. He therefore took a major gamble and split his force. One part remained before the Crusader army, while the other overran the nearby town of Tiberias, forcing Raymond's wife to flee to the local citadel. Saladin's gambit worked, and Jerusalem's leadership felt pressure to react to this turn of events. Again, the histories here are very politicized, but the consensus seems to be that Raymond wanted to stick to the template, even if it meant the complete fall of Tiberias, while Reynald saw a golden opportunity to attack. Guy ultimately followed Reynald's advice, expecting to crush Saladin's split force and score a major victory, which would both buy Jerusalem a few years' respite and also buttress his shaky rule. The decision to battle was risky, but perhaps not fatal. Jerusalem's battle tactics were designed to fight a cavalry-heavy army like the one Saladin led. The Crusaders would march in boxes, with infantry on the outside and knights on the inside. The idea was to use the infantry to shield the knights from cavalry archer fire, while the formation maneuvered into a good position, at which point the knights would launch their devastating and decisive charge. When discipline was good, these tactics often worked well. Unfortunately for the Crusaders, Guy's sudden choice left little time for preparation or logistics. Not long after he led his army out to attack, water supplies began to run low. The exhausted infantry broke formation and dissolved into a straggling mass, allowing Saladin's cavalry archers to kill off the knights' horses. Once the Crusader cavalry was destroyed, the Muslims could freely drive the enemy up the horns of Hattin, where they were surrounded and annihilated in due course. The Crusader field army was destroyed at Hattin. Guy and his supporters were captured and held for ransom, save for Reynald, whom Saladin killed as a truce-breaker. Raymond and his allies fled early, only to live lives of shame afterwards. The lower-born were either enslaved, or in the case of the military orders, killed outright. And the Levant now lay defenseless before Saladin. Hattin also destroyed the military template that the Crusaders relied on to repel Muslim invasion. The template relied on mutual support between the castles and the field army. Without a field army and support nearby, an enemy could easily bypass and isolate a castle, leaving the latter with no real military relevance nor possibility of relief. Most garrisons in this situation quickly surrendered. A few resisted for years, most notably Reynald's castle at Kerak, but their efforts were of little strategic significance. So Saladin faced little military pressure after Hattin, but he recognized that his troops expected rewards for their work. He therefore split his army into several parts, and spent the next 2 months plundering every easy target in Jerusalem, especially the surrendered cities on the rich coastal plain. In the process, even slightly resisting towns were bypassed, mostly in the south and in the north. The failure to capture these resistors, especially Tyre in the north, is often seen as a lost opportunity. But in his defense, Saladin's army was in no mood for such efforts. Besides, Saladin believed he had a foolproof solution. By late August, the army was finally put back to the task of holy war, specifically the capture of Jerusalem. This meant first clearing the strategic obstacles in the way, namely the castles of southern Jerusalem. Here, Saladin deployed his solution: the Crusader nobles captured at Hattin. Saladin offered to ransom them, not for cash, but for the surrender of their castles. It worked, and southern Jerusalem passed meekly into Muslim control. Saladin reached Jerusalem in late September. The city put up a stiff defense, but soon agreed to surrender and pay a ransom. The campaign objective and Saladin's life ambition had finally been achieved. What now? Saladin was already thinking about rehabilitating the conquered lands. Initially, he was even willing to let civilian Franks live under his rule, which the Franks themselves rejected. Saladin arranged for their semi-orderly expulsion back to Europe, but he still sought to preserve the Levant's economic base. In this vein, he rejected a proposal to destroy the Christian shrines in Jerusalem city, hoping to retain the lucrative pilgrimage trade. Such magnanimity might also indicate that Saladin expected the rest of the Crusader Levant to fall easily, which would firmly secure his conquests from European retribution. Without a local harbor, a successful naval invasion was near impossible. The coastal ports of northern Jerusalem and Tripoli itself were important in this regard. Alternatively, a large European army could technically survive the overland route through Balkan, Byzantine, and Turkish territory. The city of Antioch would be the primary defense against such an invasion. These were the targets Saladin needed to take next. In late November, Saladin began a serious effort against the northern Jerusalem port of Tyre, a city he had bypassed earlier. Initially, he tried exchanging the city for another noble, but was foiled thanks to an unexpected arrival from Europe, Conrad of Montferrat, who took charge and rejected all trades, even for King Guy himself. Saladin released Guy anyway to undermine Conrad's leadership, but it was now clear that taking Tyre would require a proper siege, which Saladin's army had never been good at. Even worse, since Tyre was on a peninsula, the city would also need to be blockaded from the sea. Now, Saladin's underinvestment in the navy would come back to haunt him, as he could only deploy 10 ships against this strategically critical objective. Presumably, he had more vessels in Egypt, but those were probably needed there to defend against Sicily, whose fleet was already sailing to help the Crusaders. Without a proper fleet, Tyre could not be taken, and Saladin lifted the siege at the end of 1187. The failure to capture Tyre meant that a European invasion of the Levant was virtually guaranteed. Over the winter, the Pope declared a Third Crusade, and the Sicilian navy began operating around the Levant. Saladin's main focus now was to preserve his strength. He did invade Tripoli and Antioch in 1188, but focused on the capture of easy but strategically irrelevant targets, rather than the well-defended Crusader capitals. This was also when the castles within the interior of the former Kingdom of Jerusalem finally surrendered. Nevertheless, a storm from Europe was coming, and weathering it would mark the final phase of Saladin's career. In the last video, we saw how Saladin had taken advantage of the Crusaders' external and internal troubles, and in 1187 launched what would turn out to be a wildly successful campaign, destroying the Crusader army at Hattin, capturing the holy city of Jerusalem, and conquering almost the entire Crusader Levant. Now, in the twilight of his life, he would have to hold all that he had gained against the might of the Third Crusade. Saladin's victories shook European leaders out of their long apathy towards the Crusader Levant, and the Pope immediately proclaimed a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem. De-emphasizing the mass movement aspects that had characterized previous expeditions, this Third Crusade sought to raise well-funded and disciplined forces that could fight an overseas campaign effectively for 2 to 3 years. To achieve this, the Pope mediated the various disputes that plagued Europe's military aristocracy, from the noble infighting within the Holy Roman Empire to the long-standing rivalry between France and Angevin England. Nevertheless, these efforts could only do so much against the defects of the feudal system. Notably, both Sicily and Angevin England underwent succession disputes after 1187, which respectively diminished and delayed their contributions. Still, Europe's leading monarchs heeded the call to crusade. For the Holy Roman Empire and France, this was a chance to demonstrate leadership over Latin Christendom. And Angevin England, who shared blood ties with Jerusalem's queen and vassalage ties with its king, had the most at stake out of them all. The first monarch to act was Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa. A mere 4 months after the crusade was called, Barbarossa left Germany in early 1188 with 20,000 men. This force achieved many feats, braving the unstable Balkans, cowing an unfriendly Byzantium, and sacking the hostile Turkish capital. But it ended abruptly in mid-90, when the emperor drowned and his soldiers fell victim to disease. The survivors straggled their way to the Levant, but they had little influence on subsequent events. Only now did the French and Angevin forces, numbering around 8,000 each, jointly leave for the Levant, under the leadership of their kings, Philippe and Richard the Lionheart, respectively. Their year-long journey was similarly eventful and chaotic. They rampaged through Sicily, upstaged and humiliated one another, and Richard then seized Cyprus from the Byzantines. The French arrived in the Levant in early 91, with the Angevins following shortly thereafter. The movement of such large armies inevitably had geopolitical consequences. From Serbia to Armenia, local rulers offered safe passage to the Crusaders in return for papal recognition, marking a major advance in the statehood of many peoples. Most of this would come at the expense of the collapsing Byzantine Empire, which probably suffered more from the Third Crusade than any Muslim state. On the other side of the Mediterranean, Saladin braced himself for the enormous challenge that lay ahead. By 1189, he had conquered the entire Crusader Levant, save for the cities of Tyre, Tripoli, and Antioch. But that was enough to make all the difference, as these cities were excellent entry points for any incoming Crusader army. And a crusade was definitely coming, not least because Barbarossa himself had announced it in his ultimatum to Saladin. Saladin did what he could to reduce these Crusader footholds. Militarily, Saladin lacked a large navy and so had little chance of capturing these ports. Instead, he decided to politically disrupt the Crusader leadership, specifically that of the early arrival Conrad of Montferrat, who had successfully defended Tyre and then appointed himself as overall commander. Against him, Saladin released the actual king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, from his post-Hattin captivity, hoping that the two would fight and destroy themselves in the process. Saladin also hoped that other states would slow the Crusaders' advance. Surprisingly, the Christian Byzantines made the most effort here, holding up Barbarossa for a few months despite heavy military pressure. The Turks were too deep in their succession crisis to put up serious resistance, while the Almohads remained unmoved, despite Saladin renouncing all claims to their lands. Least helpful of all was the Abbasid Caliph, the nominal leader of all Muslims. Threatened by Saladin's power and prestige, the Caliph infamously responded to the capture of Jerusalem with a list of grievances against him, and now would spend the Third Crusade actively destabilizing his realm. So Saladin was largely left to face Europe alone, and even worse, he soon lost the strategic initiative. Ironically, this was a direct result of his decision to politically disrupt the Crusaders, as Guy, desperate to upstage Conrad, laid siege to the city of Acre in mid-1189. Saladin quickly rushed to the scene, but by then, thousands of Crusaders had joined the siege, turning Guy's camp into a fortified base. Thus began 2 years of grinding warfare, where both sides battled, blundered, and starved before Acre's walls. Despite having the numerical advantage, Saladin repeatedly failed to break the siege, partly because of Crusader resistance, and partly because he had to detach forces to deal with first Barbarossa and then the Caliph. As a result, Saladin became just as stuck before Acre as the Crusaders were until, in mid-91, his men mutinied over the lack of progress and plunder, and refused to help the city any further. The Siege of Acre also took its toll on the Crusaders, but European newcomers continuously replenished their ranks. This all culminated in the arrival of the French and English kings in mid-91, who launched a major assault that finally forced the city to surrender. In doing so, Acre's garrison offered terms that Saladin had not agreed to. He tried to change them, but in doing so triggered Crusader suspicions of double-dealing. So their commander, King Richard, committed one of the most savage acts of the war. He gathered the surrendered Muslim prisoners and then killed them all. Richard's massacre was characteristic of medieval brutality and intolerance, but it was also done to emphasize his authority over the Crusaders. For they had not learnt the political lessons of Hattin, and instead had divided again into factions supporting either Conrad or Guy. If anything, these splits only intensified during the grueling Siege of Acre, as Guy's wife died and took his blood link to Jerusalem's dynasty with her. Conrad seized on this by forcibly marrying the last surviving heiress to the throne, but Guy's supporters remained defiant. The arriving European monarchs failed to solve this, as France's King Philippe supported Conrad, while England's King Richard stood by his ex-vassal Guy. Eventually, a compromise was struck, where Guy then Conrad would be King of Jerusalem, but this was only a prelude to Richard's real solution, where he bullied first the Germans, then Philippe out of the Third Crusade. Now Richard, at least in his own mind, had finally assumed unparalleled and supreme leadership. But supreme leadership came with its own burdens. Richard and his 10,000 men were now solely responsible for recapturing the lands lost to Saladin. And while Philippe had been a major rival on Crusade, his return to France also made Richard fear for the safety of his Angevin lands, and the news that his own brother was plotting against him didn't help matters. Richard was therefore under severe time pressure to win the Third Crusade before his own realm fell to pieces. On the other side, Saladin wasn't having an easy time confronting Richard either. The effort to relieve Acre had ultimately cost Saladin his fleet, much of his resources, and the goodwill of his men. Its failure also showed that Saladin still had no consistent counter to the armored, disciplined soldiers fielded by European forces. And to top it all off, Richard's massacre had dealt a huge psychological blow against Saladin's men, who now refused to garrison cities for fear of sharing the same fate as Acre's defenders. Faced with all this, Saladin had little choice but to employ a scorched earth policy to the Levant, hoping to deny supplies, shelter, and defenses to Richard's army. Richard began his campaign in late 1191. His force was made up of Angevin soldiers, Crusader remnants under Guy, and the French army whom Philippe graciously kept in the Levant. Conrad, by contrast, chose to stay in Tyre. The force operated similarly to Crusader practice, marching in a single column comprised of 3 divisions, each with infantry on the outside protecting the knights on the inside. But military lessons had been learned from Hattin, as Richard paid special attention to logistics, discipline, and fatigue. He kept to the coast in sight of his supply ships, rotated his infantry in and out of combat, and marched at a measured pace. Richard intended to stick to the coast up to the port of Jaffa, where he would then turn inland for Jerusalem. Saladin's army went before him, destroying the land as it went, while cavalry archers futilely shot at the armored infantry. This failed to stop Richard, and after 2 weeks, Saladin finally made a stand at Arsuf, sending waves of cavalry against Richard's divisions. The Crusader infantry held, their knights countercharged, and Saladin's army was routed. In pure military terms, this latest defeat meant little, as Richard's force was too small and slow to annihilate Saladin like at Hattin. But strategically, it meant that Saladin was out of options in dealing with Richard. The Lionheart had proven himself unbeatable in both siege and open battle. The only strategy the Muslims had left was to stall the Crusaders for as long as possible, and hope that Richard would leave the Levant before he reached Jerusalem. Within this context, Saladin's scorched earth strategy proved to be costly but successful. Unnerved by the coastal destruction, Richard's army demanded that he fortify Jaffa first before pushing beyond the supply range of his ships. This process took several weeks, which meant that by the time the Crusaders finally saw Jerusalem, it was already deep winter, and the weather was bad. There was little that Richard could do but lamely summon an army council that parroted his desire to withdraw to Jaffa, which he did to great discontent in early 92. Richard now intended to return home and leave Jerusalem for his next crusade. Over the next few months, he focused on stabilizing the Crusader kingdom and keeping it as an entry point for European forces. First, he refortified the southern castle of Ascalon to stop Saladin from threatening Jaffa. Then, he finally abandoned the disgraced Guy and gave Jerusalem's throne first to Conrad, then after Conrad's assassination, to a noble linked to both himself and the French king. Richard even asked his Angevin forces to stay in the Levant for a few more years, but they refused. At the same time, Saladin also struggled to maintain his position in the Levant. Egypt and Syria were increasingly war-weary, the Caliph was again sponsoring unrest in his realm, and his emirs and even his family began to chase their own agendas. Aware of this, in June 92, Richard lunged again at Jerusalem, and again came within eyesight of the city. Saladin had great trouble convincing his men to hold the walls, but in any case, Richard's doubts again overcame him, and his army council now advised going for Egypt instead. Sullenly, the Crusaders turned back from Jerusalem for the last time. As soon as Richard landed at Acre in mid-1191, he had begun negotiating with Saladin, though with varying degrees of seriousness. At first, Richard confidently demanded the return of all Crusader territory, but as he slowly recognized his military limitations, he began exploring alternative solutions to fulfill the Third Crusade. He even floated a radical proposal where a Muslim king and a Christian queen would jointly rule the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin rejected all these initiatives, content to watch as Richard gradually lowered his demands until they were little more than a plea to keep what he had already captured, up to and including the strategic fort of Ascalon. In the meantime, Saladin also entertained other proposals, an alliance offer from Byzantium, and even one from Conrad in Tyre, asking for a joint attack on Richard. In mid-92, the moment Saladin had been waiting for finally arrived, as a dejected Richard finally boarded a ship to Europe and the way was open for a counterattack. The Muslims attacked Jaffa, but then Richard unexpectedly returned and repelled them. Unprepared to fight another long war with him, the Muslim soldiers began another mutiny, and Saladin quickly made peace before things got out of hand. The resulting Treaty of Jaffa largely reflected the territorial control at the time, save for Ascalon, which Richard reluctantly agreed to re-demolish. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was preserved as a long coastal strip, and Christian pilgrims could visit Jerusalem once again. Neither side was thrilled with the terms, but they at least ended a military stalemate that threatened to leave them open to their other enemies. Richard could now rush back to Europe and, unluckily, into German captivity, while Saladin could finally demobilize and prepare for the impending succession. Despite its name, the treaty was meant to only last until the campaign season of 1196. That was when Richard intended to return to the Levant, but when the time came, he was too busy fighting Philippe in France. It was actually Barbarossa's successor who went on crusade, but he unexpectedly died in Sicily before the German army had even set sail. Even this did not mark the end of this crusading generation, as Philippe would play a major role in organizing the Fourth Crusade, which meant to target Egypt, but then infamously veered off to sack Constantinople. But all this was of no more concern to Saladin, who died in March 1193 at Damascus, the city where his career began. Back then, the Crusaders exploited Muslim disunity to become a major regional power. After Saladin's death, they would again exploit Muslim disunity to survive for another century. But in between these periods, Saladin brought and held the region's Muslims together, just enough to capture Jerusalem and bring it under Islam for most of the next 7 centuries. Thanks for watching the video, and please like, subscribe, and hit the bell button. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the comments section.